On the
This
6th of
cannot be
February
true.
1665, a
The proof
girl
is
was
here.
born at St.
But this
James's
changes
Palace
everything.
in London who
What
was
does it
destined to
mean?
become the last
means we
of the
must
Stuart
act.
dynasty on the English
This
throne.
cannot
She was
be
named
true.
Anne
It is.
in honor of her
The
mother,
proof is here.
Anne Hyde,
But this changes
the
everything.
daughter of an
What does it
influential
mean?
chancellor.
It means we
Her
must
father
act.
was James, Duke of York, the younger brother of the reigning king Charles II. No one could have predicted then that this fragile princess would endure more grief than rarely falls to the lot of ordinary mortals, and that her life would become an endless succession of personal tragedies and political triumph. Anne was the fourth child in the family, and from birth she was surrounded by an atmosphere of court intrigue and religious controversy. Her father had secretly converted to Catholicism, which in Protestant England was tantamount to high treason. But as long as King Charles II sat on the throne, the Duke of York felt relatively safe. The girl grew up with her older sister, Mary, who was only 2 years her senior. The sisters were inseparable. Both received a strict Protestant upbringing at the insistence of Parliament and the king, despite their father's secret Catholic sympathies. Anne's childhood could not be called carefree. When she turned 6, her mother, Anne Hyde, died. The girl was left in the care of court ladies and governesses, who tried to raise her as a worthy princess of the blood. Anne's education was typical for an aristocratic girl of that time. She studied French, music, dance, reading, and writing. However, many contemporaries noted that the princess did not shine with intellect and showed little interest in science. She was considered stubborn but simple-minded, not prone to subtle political gain. Perhaps it was precisely this apparent simplicity of character that later helped her survive in a snake pit of court intrigue. Soon after the death of his first wife, the Duke of York entered into a second marriage with the Italian Catholic Mary of Modena. Her new stepmother was only 15 years older than Anne and treated her stepdaughters coldly. The atmosphere in the family became increasingly tense. Religious contradictions tore family ties apart. Her father openly demonstrated his commitment to Catholicism, while his daughters, raised as Protestants, looked at him with growing distrust and fear. In England in those years, the memory of the religious wars was still too fresh, and Catholics were perceived as potential traitors, ready to hand the country over to the power of the Pope and the French king. From a young age, Anne suffered from poor health. She was often ill, and doctors threw up their hands, not knowing how to help the princess. The girl had vision problems. She could not see well and was constantly squinting. Furthermore, Anne began to suffer early from gout, a disease that usually afflicted the elderly. Pain in her joints tormented her, making every movement an ordeal. But the most serious ailment that haunted Anne throughout her life was constant inflammation and infection. Her body seemed unable to cope with its own illnesses, and this had fatal consequences for the future of the dynasty. In 1678, when Anne turned 13, her older sister Mary was married to William of Orange, stadtholder of Holland. Mary left for the Netherlands, and Anne remained alone at her father's court. The separation from her sister was a heavy blow for the young woman, as Mary was her only close friend and ally. Now the princess found herself surrounded by strangers, many of whom looked at her with suspicion because of her father's Catholic conviction. Anne learned to hide her feelings behind a mask of indifference, but inside she remained a vulnerable and lonely girl, dreaming of her own family and children. When Anne turned 18, the question of her marriage arose. King Charles II and the Duke of York began negotiations with various European courts, trying to find a suitable match for the princess. Candidates of German and Danish princes were considered. In the end, the choice fell on George, Prince of Denmark, the younger brother of the Danish king Christian V. George was not a brilliant man. He was not wealthy, did not possess special intelligence or talents, but he was a Protestant, which, in the eyes of the English Parliament, was the deciding factor. In the summer of 1680, Prince George arrived in England. The meeting of the young people took place in the presence of the entire court. George was a tall, fair-haired man of 30 with a good-natured face and slow manners. He was not a handsome man, but he was not repulsive either. It was said that he liked to eat and drink well, preferring quiet home entertainment to noisy court ball. Anne, who by that time had resigned herself to the idea of a dynastic marriage, was pleasantly surprised. Prince George seemed to her a calm and reliable man with whom she could build simple family happiness. The wedding took place on the 28th of July 1683 in the chapel of St. James's Palace. The ceremony was magnificent, but not overly luxurious. Anne wore a white satin dress embroidered with pearls and silver thread. On her head was a small crown adorned with diamonds. George looked solemn in a gold-embroidered doublet and white stockings. After the wedding, a feast was held, attended by King Charles II, the Duke of York, and the entire court. The king raised a toast to the health of the newlyweds and wished them numerous offspring. Back then, no one could have imagined what a bitter irony those words would become. The first months of marriage were a time of quiet happiness for Anne. She discovered that George was indeed a kind and patient husband. He did not interfere in her affairs, did not seek power or intrigue, but only wanted a quiet family life. The couple spent much time together, playing cards, walking in the gardens, and going hunting. George indulged all his wife's whims with pleasure, and Anne felt truly loved. Soon it became clear that the princess was pregnant. The news delighted everyone at court. The king and the Duke of York eagerly awaited the arrival of an heir. After all, Charles II himself had no legitimate children, and the Duke of York had only one son from his second marriage, little James. However, Anne's first pregnancy ended tragically. In May 1684, she suffered a miscarriage. The princess was devastated. Doctors tried to comfort her, saying that this often happened to young women during their first pregnancy and that the next attempt would surely be successful. Anne tried to believe them, but deep down, anxiety was already beginning to take root. George was there to support his wife, trying to distract her from sad thoughts. He ordered musicians and arranged small entertainments, but Anne could not recover for a long time after the loss of her first child. The following year, Anne became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was difficult. The princess constantly felt ill and suffered from nausea and weakness. The court doctors did not leave her side, prescribing various potions and tinctures. In 1685, a daughter was born, whom they named Mary. The child was weak and sickly, but alive. Anne was happy. Despite all her fears and anxieties, she breastfed her daughter herself, spent all her free time with her, and prayed for her health. But the joy was short-lived. The little Mary lived only 2 hours and died that same day. The next few years became for Princess Anne a series of pregnancies, miscarriages, and deaths of newborns. In 1686, another daughter was born, Anne Sophia. The baby was stronger than the first, and the parents hoped that this time everything would be fine. The girl grew, developed, and smiled at her parents. Anne and George doted on their daughter, but the happiness was short-lived. In 1687, a year after her birth, little Anne Sophia contracted smallpox and died. The year 1685 was a turning point not only in Anne's personal life but also in the history of all of England. On February 6, King Charles II passed away, leaving no legitimate heir. The throne was ascended by Anne's father, the Duke of York, who became King James II. The new monarch immediately began to pursue a policy favoring Catholics, which caused dissatisfaction in the Protestant Parliament and among the common people. James II appointed Catholics to important state and military positions, patronized the Catholic Church, and attempted to repeal laws restricting the rights of Catholics. The country began to sink into a political crisis. Anne and her sister Mary, who lived in Holland, watched their father's actions with alarm. Both princesses were raised in strict Protestantism and could not approve of his policies. James II tried to influence his daughters, urging them to convert to Catholicism, but met with a categorical refusal. This led to a cooling of relations between the king and his daughters. Anne found herself in a difficult position. On one hand, she was a daughter and had to obey her father. On the other, she was a princess of England and had to think about the good of the country and the protection of the Protestant faith. In 1688, the situation reached a critical point. On June 10, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, who was named James Francis Edward. The appearance of a legitimate Catholic son for King James II meant that the Stuart dynasty would continue and that England would be ruled by Catholic monarchs. This news caused panic among Protestants. Rumors began to spread in the country that the infant was an impostor, that the Queen's real child had died at birth, and that a strange boy had been placed in the cradle. Anne, who was not present at her stepmother's labor, publicly doubted the authenticity of the prince. This statement finally destroyed the relationship between father and daughter. In the autumn of 1688, a group of English aristocrats and parliamentarians secretly appealed to William of Orange, the husband of Mary Stuart, with a call to intervene in English affairs and save the country from Catholic tyranny. William, who had long dreamed of involving England in a coalition against Louis XIV's France, responded to the call. On the 5th of November 1688, the Dutch fleet landed at Torbay on the southern coast of England. William, at the head of an army, moved on London. James II tried to organize resistance, but his army began to scatter and defect to William's side. Even the king's own daughters supported the rebellion. Anne was in London at the time. When it became clear that James II's power was collapsing, she secretly left the capital and joined the supporters of William of Orange. This act was perceived by the king as a betrayal. James II never forgave his daughter for turning against him at the most difficult moment. On the 23rd of December 1688, the king fled from England to France, taking his wife and young son with him. Thus ended the so-called Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup, as a result of which power in England passed to William of Orange and Mary Stuart. On the 13th of February 1689, Parliament proclaimed William and Mary joint monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland. William became King William III, and Mary became Queen Mary II. Anne was declared heir to the throne, as Mary had no children. The princess hoped that now, when her sister became queen, their relationship would become warmer and more trusting. But reality turned out to be different. Mary fell under the strong influence of her husband William, who treated Anne with suspicion and distrust. He considered her weak and unpredictable, fearing that she might become the center of opposition to his power. After the accession of William III and Mary II, Anne's life changed. She remained the heir to the throne but had no real power. William treated her with cold politeness, and Mary, once a close sister, now kept her distance. Anne felt lonely and unwanted at court. Her only consolation remained her family, her husband George, who was always there and supported her through all trials. The princess continued to hope that fate would grant her a healthy child who would become the heir to the throne after Mary. In 1689, Anne became pregnant again. After so many losses, she was afraid to even think about the future. But her husband persuaded her to go for treatment to the city of Bath, where famous healing springs were located. King Henry VI once loved to rest in Bath, and it was believed that the waters of this place helped with infertility and various female illnesses. Anne spent several months there, taking baths and trying to strengthen her health. It seemed that these efforts were not in vain. On the 24th of July 1689, Anne gave birth to a son, whom they named William in honor of the king. The boy was strong and healthy. He cried loudly and suckled vigorously. Anne and George were happy. Finally, they had a child who had every chance of survival. Prince William grew and developed. He was a cheerful and inquisitive boy. He loved playing with toy soldiers and listening to stories about great military leaders. Anne doted on her son. She spent all her free time with him and personally oversaw his education and upbringing. For the little prince, the best teachers were hired to instruct him in languages, history, mathematics, and horse riding. William was declared Duke of Gloucester and recognized as the heir to the throne after his mother. The whole court pinned great hopes on him. It seemed that the Stuart dynasty would find a continuation and the country would have a stable future. But Anne's happiness was short-lived. After William's birth, she continued to get pregnant again and again, and every pregnancy ended in tragedy. In 1690, a miscarriage occurred. In 1691, a girl was born, who died shortly after birth. In 1692, another miscarriage. In 1693, a stillborn child was born. Doctors did not understand what was happening to the princess's body. They tried various methods of treatment: bloodletting, laxatives, herbal infusions, prayers, and incantations. Nothing helped. With each new loss, Anne became more depressed and withdrawn. Relations with her sister Mary continued to deteriorate. The bone of contention was Anne's lady-in-waiting, Sarah Churchill, later known as the Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah had been a close friend of Anne since her youth, and the princess trusted her completely. However, King William and Queen Mary suspected Sarah of intrigue and attempts to influence Anne for political purposes. They demanded that Anne remove Sarah from court. The princess categorically refused. This led to an open conflict. Mary forbade Anne from appearing at court, and Anne demonstratively moved from the royal palace to her own residence. The sisters stopped speaking. In 1694, Queen Mary II suddenly fell ill with smallpox. The disease progressed rapidly, and a few days later, on December 28, the Queen passed away at the age of 32. Anne was devastated by her sister's death. Despite all the quarrels and conflicts of the last years, she loved Mary and blamed herself for not having reconciled with her before her death. The princess could not forgive herself for this for a long time. After Mary's death, William III remained the sole ruler, and Anne became the official heir to the throne. But between the king and his heir, the atmosphere of mutual distrust and alienation remained. The following years continued to bring Anne grief. In 1695, she endured another miscarriage. In 1696, a stillborn girl was born. In 1697, another miscarriage. In 1698, a boy was born who died a few minutes after birth. In 1699, two more miscarriages followed. Anne was physically and emotionally exhausted. She was only 34 years old, but she looked much older. Constant pregnancies and the loss of children were destroying her health. She suffered from chronic pain, obesity, and mobility problems. Her only joy remained her 10-year-old son William, who was growing into a healthy and smart boy. The year 1700 arrived, the last year of the outgoing century. On January 25, Anne endured her last, 17th, pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage. She was 35 years old. After 17 attempts, of which only one ended in the birth of a living child, her body could no longer carry children. But the true tragedy lay ahead. On the 29th of July 1700, the 11-year-old Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, fell ill. At first, it looked like a common cold. The boy complained of a headache and a fever. The doctors did not attach much importance to this and prescribed bed rest, but the prince's condition deteriorated rapidly. The temperature rose higher and higher, and convulsions began. The court doctors tried all the remedies known to them: bloodletting, poultices, and prayers. Nothing helped. On July 30, just a day after the onset of the illness, Prince William passed away. Modern researchers believe that the cause of death was meningitis or some other acute infection that the medicine of that time could not cope with. The death of her only surviving child broke Anne. She did not cry, did not scream, did not fall into hysterics. The princess simply sat in a chair in her chambers and sat motionless for several days, refusing to see anyone or talk to anyone. It seemed that life had left her along with her son. George was also crushed by grief. He sought solace in the wine cellar, trying to drown the unbearable pain in alcohol. The couple, who had always been close and supported each other, now could not comfort one another. Each of them sank into their own grief, and it seemed their marriage would not survive the blow. The death of Prince William posed a serious dynastic problem for England. Anne was the heir to the throne, but she had no more children and could not have any. King William III was also childless. This meant that after Anne's death, the Stuart dynasty would end, and a new heir had to be sought. Parliament passed an Act of Settlement, according to which the crown, after Anne's death, was to pass to the Hanoverian dynasty, descendants of Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James I, who married the Elector Palatine. Sophia of Hanover, the granddaughter of Elizabeth, was declared the nearest heir, and after her, her son George. Anne survived these years with difficulty. She spent more and more time in seclusion, avoiding people and public events. The princess gained a lot of weight. Her health continued to deteriorate. After 30, she began to limp severely. Gout affected her leg joints, so walking caused her unbearable suffering. For movement, Anne required a special chair carried by servants. She often suffered from bouts of pain that forced her to stay in bed for several days. Doctors threw up their hands. They could not alleviate the princess's suffering. The only person who remained by Anne's side through all the trials was Sarah Churchill. This intelligent and powerful woman became not only a friend but also the princess's chief advisor. Sarah effectively managed Anne's life, deciding whom to see, whom to meet, and what political stance to take. Many at court envied Sarah's influence and tried to sow discord between her and Anne, but the princess remained deaf to any intrigue. She trusted Sarah implicitly and could not imagine her life without this friend. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, was a talented military leader, and it was thanks to Anne's patronage that he received the title of Duke of Marlborough and was able to make a brilliant career. On the 8th of March 1702, King William III died from complications after a fall from his horse. He was 51 years old. The king's death took England by surprise, although his health had long been undermined by asthma and tuberculosis. In accordance with the Act of Settlement, the crown passed to Anne Stuart. At 37, after many years of waiting, grief, and humiliation, she finally became the Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The coronation took place on the 23rd of April 1702 in Westminster Abbey. Due to her health problems, Anne had to be carried to the throne in a special chair. She could not walk, but the crown lay on her head, and the entire nation swore allegiance to her. The accession of Anne Stuart to the throne was met by the people with great enthusiasm. Unlike the foreigner William III, who remained a Dutchman at heart all his life, Anne was an Englishwoman through and through. She was born in England, spoke English without an accent, and understood the customs and traditions of her country. The people were tired of foreign rulers and rejoiced that, finally, a true English queen was on the throne. Ordinary people saw in Anne their champion, a person who understood their problems and cared for the good of the country. The first months of the new queen's reign were marked by a general uplift and hopes for a better future. Anne immediately demonstrated that she intended to rule independently. Unlike her sister Mary, who unconditionally obeyed her husband, Anne did not make George of Denmark a co-ruler. She appointed him Lord High Admiral, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, but did not give him any political power. George gladly accepted this role. He never sought power and was happy just to be near his wife. The queen surrounded herself with advisors, balancing between two parties, the Tories and the Whigs. One of the first decisions of the new queen was the appointment of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, as Commander-in-Chief of the English Army. This was a brilliant choice. Marlborough was one of the greatest military commanders of his time, a strategist and tactician the likes of which Europe had seen few. Queen Anne trusted him implicitly, and his wife Sarah remained the Queen's closest friend and advisor. Thus, the Churchill family found themselves at the center of power, which caused envy and dissatisfaction among many aristocrats. But as long as the Queen was on their side, no one dared to openly oppose Marlborough and his wife. The foreign policy situation that Anne inherited was extremely complex. England was in a state of war with France over the so-called Spanish succession. When the last Spanish king of the Habsburg dynasty, Charles II, died in 1700, the question arose as to who would occupy the throne of the vast Spanish Empire, which included not only Spain itself but also extensive colonies in America, the Netherlands, and Italy. The French king, Louis XIV, declared his grandson, Philip of Anjou, the heir, which threatened the unification of France and Spain under the rule of the Bourbon dynasty. This was unacceptable to the other European power. A coalition was formed against France, which included England, Holland, Austria, and several German states. Queen Anne supported the war. Although the people were tired of endless military conflicts, she understood that if France and Spain united, the balance of power in Europe would be disrupted and England would be in danger. The Duke of Marlborough was given carte blanche to conduct military operations. In August 1704, he won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Blenheim, routing the Franco-Bavarian army. This was one of the most significant victories of English arms for many decades. The news of the victory caused rejoicing in London. Queen Anne personally rewarded Marlborough, gifting him the Woodstock estate and ordering the construction of a magnificent palace there, which was named Blenheim in honor of the victory. The next few years the war continued with varying success. Marlborough won several more victories at Ramillies in 1706, at Oudenarde in 1708, and at Malplaquet in 1709. The English army and navy covered themselves with glory, conquering territories in Spain, the Netherlands, and the Mediterranean. England captured Gibraltar and the island of Minorca, which became important naval bases. England's colonial and naval power was growing. The country was turning into one of the leading powers of Europe. All this happened under Queen Anne, and the people thanked her for the prosperity and glory. But the domestic political situation in the country was far from stable. Parliament was split into two warring parties, the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories supported a strong monarchy, the Anglican Church, and a peaceful foreign policy. The Whigs advocated for the limitation of royal power, religious tolerance, and active war with France. Queen Anne tried to balance between the parties, but it was not easy. Initially, she relied on the Tories, but the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough were Whigs, and their influence gradually inclined the Queen to support this party. In 1705, Anne dismissed most of the Tory ministers and appointed a new government in which the Whigs predominated. This caused dissatisfaction among her former allies, but the Queen was adamant. One of the most important tasks facing Queen Anne was the regulation of relations with Scotland. Formally, England and Scotland were separate kingdoms, united only by the person of the monarch. Each country had its own parliament, its own laws, and its own traditions. But this state of affairs created many problems. The Scottish Parliament could make decisions contradicting English policy, which threatened a split at a critical moment. Furthermore, after Anne's death, Scotland could theoretically choose a different monarch, which would lead to the restoration of borders and a possible war between the two countries. Negotiations about the union began during King William III's time but had reached a stalemate. The Scots feared losing their independence and dissolving into a richer and more powerful England. The English, in turn, feared having to bear the financial burden of maintaining their poor northern neighbor. Queen Anne understood that the question of the union needed to be resolved immediately while she was alive. After her death, a dynastic crisis could lead to civil war and the dissolution of the state. She ordered the resumption of negotiations and personally followed their progress. Negotiations were difficult. The Scottish aristocracy was divided into two camps, supporters and opponents of the union. Opponents pointed out that Scotland would lose its identity, that English laws would be imposed on the Scots, and that the Parliament in Edinburgh would be dissolved. Supporters of the union spoke of economic benefits. Scottish merchants would gain access to English colonies. Trade duties between the countries would be abolished. Scottish industry and agriculture would receive investments. Furthermore, The union guaranteed a peaceful future. There would be no more wars between England and Scotland that had devastated both countries for centuries. The English government used not only arguments but also direct threat. The Scottish Parliament was given to understand that if the union was not accepted, England would impose economic sanctions, close the border, and perhaps even start military operations. At the same time, bribes were generously distributed to Scottish aristocrats who voted in Parliament. Historians still argue about how much of a role corruption played in the adoption of the Act of Union, but it is obvious that many Scottish lords received large sums of money for their support of the merger. The common people of Scotland were categorically against the Union and staged riots, but the opinion of the commoners interested no one. On the 16th of January 1707, the Scottish Parliament ratified the Act of Union. On the 1st of May 1707, the Union came into force. The Kingdom of England and Scotland ceased to exist as separate states and formed the unified Kingdom of Great Britain. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved, and from then on, all of Great Britain was governed from Westminster. Scotland received representation in the British Parliament, 45 seats in the House of Commons, and 16 inches the House of Lords. A single currency, a single customs system, and unified trade and shipping laws were established. Scotland retained its legal system and the Presbyterian Church, but in all other respects, it became part of a single state. Queen Anne triumphed. The creation of Great Britain was her greatest achievement, the work of her life. Now the island was united under the power of one monarch and one parliament. This strengthened the country's security and created the foundation for a future of greatness. Anne went down in history as the first monarch of Great Britain, and this title was dearer to her than any military victory. She understood that the Stuart dynasty was ending with her, but she wanted to leave behind a strong and unified state that would survive her death and prosper under new rulers. However, not everyone was satisfied with the union. In Scotland, uprisings of Jacobites, supporters of the exiled King James II and his son James Francis Edward, who lived in France under the protection of Louis XIV, periodically flared up. The Jacobites considered Anne a usurper and demanded the restoration of the legal Stuart dynasty in the person of the Catholic line. In 1708, the Jacobites attempted to land in Scotland with a French landing force, but the English fleet routed the French squadron, and the invasion failed. Anne dealt brutally with the conspirators, many of whom were executed or sent into exile. She could not forgive those who tried to take her crown in favor of a half-brother whom she considered an impostor. As the years of her reign went by, Queen Anne's health continued to deteriorate. She suffered from many diseases: gout, obesity, erysipelas of the skin, and frequent bouts of fever. She could no longer move independently and spent almost all her time in a chair or in bed. For movement around the palace, special litters were used, carried by 4 servants. Court doctors tried all known methods of treatment, but nothing helped. Modern medicine suggests that Anne suffered from systemic lupus erythematosus or antiphospholipid syndrome, autoimmune diseases that would explain both her numerous miscarriages and her chronic inflammation and premature aging. Her only consolation for the Queen remained her husband, George. They lived together for more than 25 years, endured the death of 17 children, political storms, and revolution. George was always there, never betrayed, never intrigued, never tried to seize power. He simply loved his wife and wanted her to be happy. Anne reciprocated his feelings and said that George was the only person she could trust completely. They spent their evenings together playing cards, talking about the past, and remembering their children. In these quiet family evenings, the Queen found rare moments of peace and happiness. On the 28th of October 1708, Prince George of Denmark passed away from asthma and respiratory failure. He was 55 years old. The death of her husband was a terrible blow for Anne. She lost her last close person, the last support in her life. The Queen sobbed for days on end, refused to eat, and did not want to talk to anyone. Friends feared that she would not survive this grief and would follow her husband to the grave. For several weeks, Anne remained in a state of deep depression, from which she was gradually brought out by the Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah forced the Queen to eat, leave the room, and engage in state affairs. Gradually, Anne returned to life. But joy had left her heart forever. After George's death, relations between the Queen and the Duchess of Marlborough began to deteriorate. Sarah was a powerful and ambitious woman who was accustomed to completely controlling Anne's life. She chose whom the Queen should communicate with, what policy to pursue, and whom to appoint to positions. For many years, Anne had obediently submitted because Sarah was indeed her close friend. But after her husband's death, something changed in the Queen's soul. She began to realize that Sarah was using their friendship for selfish purposes, that a cold calculation was hidden behind the mask of affection. Anne began to notice how rudely Sarah treated her, how dismissively she related to her opinion, and how openly she demonstrated her superiority. At this time, a new favorite appeared at court, Abigail Masham, a distant relative of the Duchess of Marlborough. Abigail was the complete opposite of Sarah, quiet, modest, and submissive. She did not try to give the Queen advice, did not interfere in politics. She was simply there and offered comfort in difficult moments. Anne began to spend more time with Abigail and less with Sarah. The Duchess of Marlborough sensed the danger and tried to get rid of her rival, but it was too late. The Queen was tired of Sarah's tyranny and longed to be free from her influence. Quarrels, mutual reproaches, and scandals began. The relationship, which had lasted more than 30 years, was falling apart before everyone's eyes. In 1711, a final break occurred. Sarah, in the presence of courtiers, was rude to the Queen, and Anne ordered her to leave the palace and never appear at court again. The Duchess of Marlborough was furious but could do nothing. Along with her, her husband, the great military leader, the Duke of Marlborough, fell into disgrace. Anne removed him from command of the army and sent him into retirement. This was a cruel blow for a man who had done so much for England's glory. But the Queen was adamant. She no longer wanted to see Sarah or her husband. New military leaders were appointed to replace Marlborough, and the Queen's new favorite became Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, leader of the Tory party. The removal of Marlborough coincided with a change in foreign policy. By 1711, the War of the Spanish Succession had been dragging on for more than 10 years and was costing England vast sums of money. The people were tired of the war and demanded peace. Queen Anne, who always listened keenly to the moods of her subjects, decided it was time to end the conflict. The Whigs, who supported the war to the bitter end, lost their influence. The new Tory government began secret negotiations with France to conclude a peace. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession. The Peace of Utrecht brought Great Britain significant benefits. England received Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain, which became vital naval bases in the Mediterranean. From France, Britain received territories in North America, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay. Furthermore, England achieved a monopoly on the slave trade in the Spanish colonies, the so-called Asiento, which brought enormous profit. The Spanish throne went to Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V, but on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united. This was a reasonable compromise that satisfied the interests of all parties. However, many in England considered the Peace of Utrecht disgraceful. The Whigs accused Queen Anne and the Tory government of betraying their allies, Austria and Holland, who continued the war and hoped for English support. They argued that England could have achieved much greater concessions if it had continued military operations. The Duke of Marlborough, who was in disgrace, publicly condemned the peace treaty and accused the Queen of weakness. This caused Anne's anger. She could not forgive the former favorite for his public criticism and did everything to finally destroy his reputation. Marlborough was accused of corruption and embezzlement of state funds and was forced to leave England. The last years of Queen Anne's reign were marked by a fierce struggle for power between the Tory and Whig parties. The Queen tried to remain independent, but her health had deteriorated so much that she could no longer effectively control the situation. Ministers wove intrigues, deceived the queen, and hid important information from her. Anne understood that power was slipping through her fingers, but she was too ill and weak to change anything. She spent more and more time in her chambers, seeing only her closest people, Abigail Masham, and a few trusted courtiers. The main question that worried everyone was the succession. According to the Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, after Anne's death, the crown was to pass to Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of King James I, and after her to her son George, Elector of Hanover. But Sophia was already very old. She was over 80. Many doubted she would outlive Anne. Furthermore, in England, there existed a strong Jacobite party that wanted to invite James Francis Edward, son of the exiled King James II and Anne's half-brother, to the throne. Queen Anne was in a difficult position. On one hand, she was loyal to the law and recognized the Hanoverian dynasty as her legitimate heirs. On the other, deep in her soul, she sympathized with her brother, although she considered his Catholic faith an obstacle to his accession to the English throne. Anne tried several times to establish contact with James Francis, offering him the chance to renounce Catholicism in exchange for recognition as her heir. But James categorically refused to change his faith. This made his candidacy unacceptable for Protestant England. Parliament kept a close watch on the Queen, fearing that at the last moment she might attempt to change the order of succession in favor of her brother. On the 8th of June 1714, Sophia, Electress of Hanover, passed away in Hanover. She was 84 years old and had lived a surprisingly long life. Now, the official heir to the throne was her son George, Elector of Hanover, a 54-year-old man who barely spoke English and had never been to England. This news caused mixed feelings at court. On one hand, the heir was determined by law, and his rights were indisputable. On the other hand, few in England wanted to see another foreigner on the throne who did not know English customs and traditions. Queen Anne was dying. In the summer of 1714, she suffered several attacks that modern doctors would identify as strokes. The right side of her body was failing, her speech was becoming slurred, and her consciousness was periodically clouded. The court doctors understood that the Queen's days were numbered, but they did not dare say it aloud. Anne was only 49 years old, but she looked like an old woman. Illness, grief, endless pregnancies, and the loss of her children had destroyed her body long before its time. She spent her last weeks in bed, surrounded by servants and a few faithful courtiers. On the 27th of July 1714, the Queen's condition deteriorated sharply. She developed a high fever. Her skin was covered with red spots, signs of erysipelas. Doctors tried to bring the temperature down with compresses and bloodletting, but it did not help. Anne fell into a delirium, babbled, and called out the names of her long-deceased children and husband. Sometimes she came to her senses, and then she prayed, asking God for forgiveness for her sins and praying for the salvation of her soul. A priest was called to her bedside, and he administered the last rites. Everyone understood that the end was near. On the 1st of August 1714, around 7:00 the morning, Queen Anne Stuart passed away at Kensington Palace. She died of erysipelas and general exhaustion of the body. By her side until the last minute was Abigail Masham, the only close person who remained with the Queen at the end of her life. Anne's death was met by the people with sincere sorrow. Despite all the political contradictions and failures of the last years, the English loved their queen and remembered how much she had done for the country. With her death ended the era of the Stuart dynasty, which had ruled England and Scotland for more than 100 years. The funeral of Queen Anne took place on the 24th of August 1714 in Westminster Abbey. Her body was buried next to her husband, Prince George of Denmark, in the vault of Henry VII. The funeral was attended by all members of the government, the highest aristocracy, and representatives of the church and parliament. The people stood in silence along the streets through which the funeral procession passed. Many wept, remembering the kind queen who had always tried to care for the good of her subjects. On that day, England said goodbye not only to a monarch but to a whole era of its history. Immediately after Anne's death, George I, Elector of Hanover, ascended the throne in accordance with the Act of Settlement. He arrived in England only a few weeks after the Queen's funeral, not knowing the English language and understanding almost nothing of English politics. A new era was beginning, the era of the Hanoverian dynasty, which would rule Great Britain for the next 2 centuries. The Jacobites tried to organize an uprising in favor of James Francis Edward, but the rebellion was quickly suppressed. Protestant England did not want a Catholic king, even if he was from the old Stuart dynasty. The story of Queen Anne Stuart is the story of a woman who endured incredible suffering and yet was able to leave a significant mark on the history of her country. 17 pregnancies, all ending in tragedy except one, and even the only surviving child died in childhood. Such grief would be enough to break any person. But Anne did not break. She continued to live, to perform her duty, to rule the country, even when the pain became unbearable. This inner strength, hidden behind external fragility and illness, makes her one of the most tragic and at the same time inspiring figures in English history. Anne's reign lasted 12 years, from 1702 to 1714. During this time, Great Britain turned into one of the leading European powers. The victories of the Duke of Marlborough in the War of the Spanish Succession strengthened the country's military power. The Peace of Utrecht brought significant territorial acquisitions and trade advantages. But the main achievement of Anne's reign was the creation of the unified Kingdom of Great Britain by uniting England and Scotland. This was an event of immense historical importance, which determined the future of the British nation for centuries to come. The Act of Union of 1707 changed the map of Europe forever. Instead of two warring kingdoms, a unified state with a common parliament, common laws, and a common foreign policy emerged. This unification created the prerequisites for the future greatness of the British Empire. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Great Britain would become the largest colonial power in the world. Its fleet would dominate all seas. Its industry would become the most powerful in the world. And it all started under Queen Anne, who had the wisdom and will to carry out the unification despite the resistance of many influential forces. Anne's personal life was always closely intertwined with politics. Her childlessness had huge political consequences because it led to a change of dynasty and the coming to power of the Hanoverian. Modern historians argue about what exactly was the cause of the Queen's reproductive problems. Some believe she suffered from incompatibility with her husband, a situation where the mother's body produces antibodies against the fetus's blood. Others believe the cause was antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune disease that causes blood clots in the placenta and death of the fetus. Third, point to hereditary porphyria, a disease suffered by many representatives of the Stuart dynasty. Whatever the medical cause, one thing is clear. Anne Stuart paid a terrible personal price for her crown. She lost all her children, endured the death of her beloved husband, suffered from many chronic illnesses, and died at the age of 49, looking much older than her years. But at the same time, she fulfilled her royal duty. She ruled wisely and fairly, cared for the good of her subjects, and strengthened the greatness of her country. History remembers her not as an unhappy woman who lost all her children, but as a great queen who created Great Britain. Anne's relationship with her loved ones was complex and ambiguous. She quarreled with her father, King James II, supporting the revolution against him. She grew distant from her sister Mary due to the influence of her husband, William of Orange. She severed a long-standing friendship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, when she felt she was being used. These conflicts show that Anne, despite her apparent weakness and softness of character, was capable of decisive actions when it came to her dignity or state interests. She knew how to be firm, even cruel, when it was necessary. Religion played an important role in Queen Anne's life. She was a deeply religious Anglican and considered the protection of the Protestant Church her main duty. It was religious considerations that forced her to support the overthrow of her Catholic father and refuse to recognize her half-brother as heir, who was also a Catholic. Under Anne, the Anglican Church was significantly strengthened. Many new churches were built, and stipends for priests were increased. The Queen personally donated large sums to charity, helping the poor, the sick, and orphans. This sincere religiosity won her the love of the common people, who saw in the Queen a protector before God. Cultural life in England under Queen Anne experienced a flowering. This was the time of great writers: Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe, and Alexander Pope. The Queen patronized the arts and sciences, although she was not distinguished by special education herself. Music flourished at her court. The court composer was the great George Friedrich Handel, who wrote music for royal ceremonies. Architecture also reached a high level. The magnificent Blenheim Palace was built for the Duke of Marlborough. Windsor Castle was rebuilt. New churches were erected based on designs by the famous architect Christopher Wren. England's economy under Anne developed rapidly. The completion of the War of the Spanish Succession and the conclusion of the favorable Peace of Utrecht opened new opportunities for trade. English merchants gained access to Spanish colonies in America, a monopoly on the slave trade across the Atlantic, and control over vital trade routes. The Bank of England was founded, which became the center of the country's financial system. Industry developed textile, metallurgical, and shipbuilding. London turned into one of the largest trade and financial centers of Europe. All this created the foundation for the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. Military successes in the times of Queen Anne became legendary. The battles of Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet became classic examples of military art. The Duke of Marlborough, despite his disgrace at the end of the reign, remained in the people's memory as one of the greatest military commanders in the history of England. The English fleet under Anne dominated the seas, having captured Gibraltar and Minorca, controlling trade routes between Europe, Africa, and America. The military power created during the years of Anne's reign allowed Great Britain in the next century to defeat France in the struggle for world domination. History remembers Queen Anne as the last representative of the Stuart dynasty and the first monarch of a unified Great Britain. Her reign was a bridge between the old and the new, between the medieval monarchy and a modern constitutional state, between religious wars and the Age of Enlightenment, between an isolated island nation and a future world empire. Anne was not a great politician or military commander. She did not possess outstanding intellect or talent, but she possessed the most important thing: a sense of duty, perseverance, and a sincere concern for the good of her country. This proved to be enough to go down in history as a great queen. The tragedy of Anne Stuart's life lay in the fact that she could not provide the country with an heir from her own dynasty. 17 pregnancies, 17 hopes, 17 disappointments. This is a trial that few are capable of enduring. Contemporaries pitied the Queen and called her the most unhappy woman in England. But Anne did not seek pity. She continued to perform her duty until the last day, until the last breath, and when death finally came for her, she met it with dignity, as befits a queen. Her last words, according to eyewitnesses, were a prayer for the well-being of England and her people. Queen Anne's legacy lives on to this day. Great Britain, created under her, has existed for more than 3 centuries and remains one of the leading powers of the world. The Act of Union of 1707, despite periodic attempts at its revision, continues to operate. The territories conquered in the War of the Spanish Succession, Gibraltar, Minorca, and the Canadian provinces became part of the British Empire and largely determined its future greatness. The era of Anne is remembered in England as a time of national upswing, when the country found unity and confidence in its own strength. In the memory of the people, Queen Anne remained a kind, fair ruler who cared for ordinary people. During her reign, there were no mass repressions, executions, or religious persecutions. She tried to reconcile warring parties, find compromises, and avoid extreme. This moderation and common sense were exactly what England needed after the storms of the 17th century: civil wars, revolutions, and religious conflicts. Anne gave the country 12 years of relative peace and stability, which allowed it to heal the wounds of the past and prepare for future challenges. And for this, she will be remembered forever.